All right, I see that everyone is coming in. Welcome everyone to our webinar with Manhattan Psychology Group. A lot of people coming in. So today our topic is in verbal behavior. It's the conditioned seeing protocol with Dr. Derek Shanman. He's from Nichols State University. And I'm just going to go over a little bit about Manhattan Psychology Group as everyone's coming in. I am with Manhattan Psychology Group. We're hosting this webinar today. And just to give a little bit of background, Manhattan Psychology Group is comprised of 3 separate companies. There's the Manhattan Psychology Group, which is dealing with different psychological interventions and therapies, including ABA. There's also MPG tutoring and Manhattan Psychology Associates, which are insurance-based cases. If you want to know more about the different companies within MPG, there's going to be a separate meeting after this webinar, and I will be putting that link into the chat box. So stay tuned. I just want to share our mission. That we would like to improve the trajectory for individuals and their families who struggle with psychological, developmental, or educational challenges. And we try to do this as early as possible. And we serve the greater New York City metro area. So we are helping adolescents, children, young adults, couples, and that goes for ABA and other psychological services as well. So our vision is to create a future where children and individuals feel confident and lead independent and productive lives filled with connected and meaningful relationships. So we are growing, we are continuing to grow, and we provide mental health services, ABA, educational services, all within the New York City area. So again, if you're interested, we're going to have a separate meeting at the end of this webinar in another link. So that you can learn more about Manhattan Psychology Group. So a lot of you here are BCBAs. We always get teachers and speech therapists and other providers, parents as well. But if you are a BCBA and you are looking to get a CEU for this event, you will need to complete the survey. This will be in the tab after this webinar, and this will also be sent to you 24 hours from now in an email. So you will need to complete that survey. If you don't get the survey in the tab within your browser after this event, then it will arrive tomorrow evening in your email. So please complete this. Sorry, that second bullet point is off, but please complete this by next Monday, which is, I want to say, April 4th. So Monday, April 4th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you submit it after this time and date, you may not receive a certificate. So please do that as soon as you can. The certificates and proof of attendance is only for BCBA participants. So I just want to make that super clear. And there will be a recording available towards mid-April. So let's say April 18th. Okay. The recording will be available. And remember that the survey will show up in your browser when the webinar ends. And it will also show up in an email tomorrow. So please complete that survey if you are a BCBA looking for a certificate. In this webinar, we are going to be answering questions in the Q&A, not from the chat. So you can make comments in the chat. But if you have a question, it would be great to put that in the Q&A so it doesn't get lost in the chat. About BCABAs, we are only providing CEUs. That's a good question, Jenna. Send me an email. And I'm gonna look into it because I haven't had that question before. I'm putting my email in the chat. Perfect. All right, so today's webinar is the relation between components of naming and conditioned seeing. Dr. Derek Shanman is an assistant professor at Nichols State University. He's also a graduate faculty member in the High Incidence Disabilities Program, and he teaches courses in teaching and applied behavioral analysis for graduate and undergraduates. He's focused on verbal behavior, and he's presented several times at regional, national, and international conferences. So we're very excited to have Dr. Derek Sherman here today. And he knows a lot about naming and condition seeing. So let's see what he has for us today.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. I want to give you a heads up right now that I am in New Orleans, Louisiana, and we are about to have some severe weather come through. So hopefully my internet connection stays stable enough to get through this. If not, then I'll make sure that you guys get all the content that you deserve at a date soon to be determined. So tonight we are going to talk about condition seeing. This talk is based on my dissertation, which was completed, dare I say, close to 10 years ago. So there have been some advances since this, but I still think that these procedures and these concepts are very much necessary for behavior analysts to talk about, because it is not a well studied or well understood topic. So we are going to talk tonight about condition seeing, particularly as in two respects. One, identifying whether or not condition seeing is a behavior of interest for study by behavior analysts. And if so, is there any relation between condition seeing as a repertoire and the development of the naming capability? My understanding is that in recent weeks, Kristen did a webinar on naming. So there should be good background knowledge either by the current participants or through viewing some of those past webinars on naming. So I'm not going to spend as much time going into detail on the naming capability in and of itself. But rather I will focus in on the components that are significant to condition seeing. So Skinner, 1953, defined condition seeing as a behavior or as a condition reflex that is emitted in the absence of the actual stimulus to a stimulus that has been previously paired with the presence of a stimulus. So whenever we can see a stimulus in the absence of the stimulus being there, then, or any other stimulus that is related to that, then that is an evidence of condition seeing. This is a covert behavior, which covert behaviors in general have been a challenge for behavior analysts to look at. Condition seeing has recently been identified by Kyle Miguel as a behavior that may be imperative to the development of naming. The study that we're talking about, I think, provided some evidence of that prior to that statement, and we'll like to see where that goes. So we are going to be looking at procedures that are utilized to identify whether or not condition seeing is a behavior of interest, whether it exists in individuals, and whether or not it can be isolated as a significant repertoire relative to the naming capability. All right, next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Shanman. I just wanted to share the poll results. The first question was, I've heard of condition seeing, and 52% of the people have said false, they have not, and 31% said it rings a bell. 17% have heard of it, and 9% have implemented the condition seeing protocol before, and 91% of us have not implemented a condition seeing protocol before.
All right, so given that a majority of us have not heard of condition seeing, I will make sure to really emphasize the components of this that help define what condition seeing is. All right. All right, so naming in and of itself, to give a background for the context that we're going to be looking at, is a higher order bidirectional relation that looks to join speaker and listener behavior. It does not require reinforcement of both speaker and listener behavior for each new name to be established. Naming, as we know, is hugely significant in the language explosion that is identified in Hart and Risley. It is the vehicle by which behavior analysts are able to explain how children really get from speaking 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 words to 100, 200, thousands of words in a very short period of time. All right. So for those children that do not have sufficient instructional experiences for naming to emerge, meaning that they have not contacted this listener, speaker, stimulus relationship in a meaningful way, there have been a number of protocols that have been identified that allow for the induction of the naming capability. And the significance of this is that it tells us that there is a functional relationship between these particular interventions and what really accounts for a significant period of growth in children. So some of those interventions are multiple exemplar instruction across listener and speaker responses, intensive tact, and auditory matching. What we need to make sure that we are able to understand, though, is that while there are these 3 interventions in place, it is not going to be the case that any one of these interventions is necessarily going to work for any one particular child. In other words, these interventions have prerequisites in order for them to be effective. Go ahead. So Longano and Greer in a dissertation in 2006, and I believe a since published study, have identified one of the sources of reinforcement for naming. In other words, one of the repertoires that is going to be not necessarily prerequisite to, but present from or present for the naming repertoire to be established. And that repertoire is the observing responses for visual and auditory stimuli. When we talk about visual stimuli, obviously we're talking about the visual stimulus, the name of the thing, or the thing that we are going to be learning their name. When we talk about the auditory stimulus, though, what we're really referring to is the name itself. And when we start talking about emitting names, we start thinking about tax, we think about echoic behavior, and then that gives us a groundwork to start to look at what is happening from an auditory standpoint as children are acquiring the names of things. So the caregiver holds up the name of an item, they say the name of the item, the child says the name of the item back, and the caregiver provides reinforcement to the child for saying the name. And that echoic is a direct behavior that can be measured. What we see when we have children who are either inducing or having naming induced or naturally having naming emerge is in the absence of the things that they are learning, they may say the names of the thing that we are learning. They're emitting this this overt auditory stimulus that maintains the behavior over time. So if I hold up shoe and the child says shoe, in the presence of shoe, well, in the absence of shoe, they may go around saying shoe, 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 shoe. And that is identified as echoic behavior. And that echoic behavior becomes a source of reinforcement for naming. What this study was not able to take a look at is, you can go to the next slide, sorry. I think. Yeah, there we go. What this study was not able to look at, though, was what is happening relative to the visual stimulus. So if we are emitting this echoic behavior for the auditory stimulus, then is the same thing happening for the visual stimulus? So we're going to put Longano and Greer on pause. We're going to put echoic behavior on pause. We're going to take a look at what condition seeing is and how it's possibly related to naming. So where Skinner says one may see or hear stimuli which are not present on the pattern of the conditioned reflex. You may see X not only when X is present, but when any stimulus which has frequently been accompanied by X is present. So if I learn shark as X, right? So when the word shark is paired with an image of a shark, then I develop that relationship over time. Shark, image, shark, image. In the absence of seeing the image of a shark, but upon hearing the word shark, so now the image is absent, but I hear the auditory stimulus, it may evoke the stimulus, the visual stimulus, even in its absence. But how do we measure that, right? Going beyond that, we may say teeth or bite or swimming or jaws or other words that have been paired with the image of a shark. And through a conditioned seeing response, we would see that image of a shark. All right. So it's not just when we see when the image is present that we can identify it, but when the image is absent and we hear these conditioned words or these words that have been paired with the image, those words may evoke the image. All right. So one study that looked at a series of studies that looked at something akin to conditioned seeing were a series of studies by Lowenkron in the late 80s and mid 90s. And what Lowenkron did was he used a sort of naming paradigm, sort of conditioned seeing paradigm, where he provided the name of a stimulus and a hand signal to individuals. And what he found was that over time, or in the absence of the stimulus that was paired with the hand signal, the participants who could identify the stimulus later practiced the hand signal in the absence of the stimulus. Now, what's interesting about that is that by having the hand signal present, you are creating a visual stimulus, and the participants were actually deaf. So that functioned as their version of an auditory stimulus as well. Now, from a pure way of looking at conditioned seeing, the presence of one's hand negates the ability to say that this is truly a conditioned sensory response, because you can say, that's not quite it, that's not quite it, that's it. So you have this ability to get that immediate feedback and correct how you are shaping your own conditioned sensory response here. But what it was able to show is that a visual stimulus practiced over time could maintain something akin to a naming behavior. All right. So when it comes, go ahead and move to, there we go. Yep, you're good, you're good. So when it comes to research questions related to conditioned seeing, there wasn't a whole lot for us to stand on. There were no attempts to measure conditioned seeing. There were no attempts to identify what we would be looking for in conditioned seeing, but rather from the conceptual idea of seeing a thing in the absence of its presence. And the evidence that was shown from Longano and Greer with the echoic behavior, we were able to kind of piece together that it would follow that some sort of conditioned sensory response related to the visual stimulus was necessary for the naming repertoire to develop and go back. Yep, sorry. So from that, we were able to define these questions. So question number one, is conditioned seeing a behavior that occurs during the acquisition of visual object name relations and are drawing responses a measure of this behavior? So the question basically is, breaking that down, during a naming experience. Does condition seeing occur? And if so, can we look at something like drawing what you are seeing in the absence of the thing as a measure of that behavior? Can a drawing response be a byproduct of condition seeing? Second, is there any relation between the demonstration of condition seeing and either speaker or listener component of naming? And finally, if absent, is there a relation between the acquisition of naming and the demonstration of condition seeing? And that one gets into Lingano and Greer that I spoke about before. So we'll get back to that. All right, go ahead. All right, so first question related to condition seeing. Can we even define condition seeing as a behavior of interest? So because condition seeing is covert, it is imperative that we have a byproduct of condition seeing that can be identified or that can be observed, measured, and verified. If any of those three metrics was not present, then we cannot say that condition seeing is a behavior of interest. So in this study, it's not simply that we could say draw this and say yes, that is condition seeing, but can we measure it and can we verify it? All right, go ahead. So to go about identifying whether or not drawing responses were a possible measure of condition seeing, we did this in the paradigm of a naming probe. We knew that we were going to be looking at naming, the relationship between naming and condition seeing. So what we did was, and I'll get to this in our procedure in a second, but we did a full naming probe with naming experiences, listener responses, and speaker responses. And then we gave our participants a piece of paper with 5 squares. I'll show you that in a bit. And we said, draw the 5 stimuli. Now, I got some feedback, and I don't think it's wrong. Is this truly condition seeing? Because I didn't say the names of the stimulus. Skinner also has another behavior called operant seeing, where you produce the behavior, your own reinforcement produces the behavior. I think that this could go either way. I made a conscious decision not to provide the names because I did not want any SDs present related to the naming experience. So for our drawing responses, they were not taught, they were not reinforced, they were not practiced in the presence of the stimuli at any point in time, and no SDs were present to signal reinforcement for accuracy of drawing responses when the stimuli were present. In other words, we did not give any indication of what was going to be happening. So therefore, we decided that because of these 4 components, that drawing responses would meet the criterion for a byproduct of condition seeing. All right, so not to say that they are verifiable yet, but that this would be a drawing response of a previously presented stimulus should represent a byproduct of condition seeing. There's an assumption here that I think is very, very important, that the stronger someone's conditioned seeing response is, the better the drawing response should be. And if you think about it, what should be happening is you're not just pulling the response, the drawing response out of thin air, but you're seeing it. And if your seeing response, your conditioned seeing response is stronger, then you have a more accurate picture to effectively copy. So when you draw that response on paper, you are simply copying what you are seeing covertly. This is a really significant idea to keep in mind. So, all right, go on. All right, so we started off by we had 12 participants. All of these participants were typically developing second grade students. Everything that we did took place right outside my classroom, so there were no distractions, there was no overflow, you didn't hear what someone else's stimuli were, so on and so forth. Go ahead. And our materials were arbitrary. This was very important to the study. We did not want instructional history in any way, shape, or form to get to act as a confound in for either the auditory or the visual stimulus. The only instructional history that we made sure that was present was when we assigned the vocal stimuli. We made sure that they were CVC sounded words that followed English phonemic patterns. All right, so if you go to the next slide, you'll see both the visual stimuli that we used as well as the auditory stimuli that we used. So we randomly assigned any auditory stimulus to any visual stimulus. These are the sets that kind of came out. The auditory stimuli were assigned a particular set because we wanted to control for vowel patterns. We didn't want all the A's to be together, all the O's to be together, so on and so forth. And then they were randomly assigned to a visual stimulus. All right. So here are the data sheets that we used. On the left, we had the visual stimulus. So this is our naming data sheet. The slashed boxes on the left were so we could draw the visual stimulus and write the auditory stimulus, because we were doing this with all these participants. We weren't going to be able to remember who was getting what. We also wanted to measure behavior during the naming probes to make sure that we weren't finding some other confounding variables. So when we presented the naming stimuli, we measured whether or not they echoed, whether they echoed incorrectly, whether they nodded, signaling yes, they heard it, whether they mouthed the name of the stimulus, whether they whispered the name of the stimulus, whether they said it out loud in the presence of the stimulus, or whether they had no response. So for the naming experience, we really wanted to make sure that there was no significant correlation between these naming experience behaviors and what we saw in the future. And then on the right, we see the drawing response data form that was used. So this was very simply a piece of paper with 5 boxes on it where we said, draw the stimuli. All right. So what were our dependent variables here? First was the drawing responses. So was drawing a representation of the stimulus in the absence of the stimulus? Correct responses were determined by a panel of independent observers. I'm going to go over that in a second because this was critical to the establishment of condition seeing as a verifiable behavior. We had the listener component of naming, which was pointing to a stimulus after the experimenter said point to X. Speaker component of the naming was holding up the stimulus and having the participant tact the stimulus. We did not do any sort of intraverbal response. In many of the naming papers that you will read, there's both a tact response and an intraverbal response. Those two response topographies were equivalent for all of our students that had been established prior to this study. And criterion was 80% for all responses, which for drawing responses meant 4 out of 5 correct drawing responses and 16 out of 20 for listener and speaker. All right, code number 1.
Yes, code 1, please write the code down. The code is autoclitic. I'm going to take 30 seconds to let everybody write down code number 1, autoclitic. All right, and we're going to be moving on. Hopefully everybody wrote down code number 1, autoclitic.
All right, so our independent variable, and this is where it got a little bit trickier. was the implementation of a delayed phonemic response teaching intervention to teach the vocal stimuli using echoic learn units. Yes, I made that up. That is not an evidence-based intervention, but it was sound, I promise you, and we'll go over that in detail. So what this, and I'll go over this in a little bit more, but what this was used to do was to control for that echoic responses that Lungano and Greer had identified as necessary for development of the naming repertoire. So it ensured one-to-one correspondence between the stimulus name and the participant response, and it provided a history of reinforcement with auditory stimuli. All right, data were collected on correct and incorrect responses for listener, speaker, and during the naming probes. And then we went to the validation for our drawing responses. So as I said before, we needed to make sure that we could verify whether or not these drawing responses were a measure. So what we did was had 10 independent observers, and 8 out of 10 of the observers needed to, I actually wrote here that needed to rescore the response as correct, but they actually needed, 8 out of 10 observers needed to have the same response. So to identify something as incorrect, they needed to identify that 8 out of 10 needed to identify them as incorrect as well. Data were collected on the number of within session and delayed echoic responses submitted by the participants. We'll go over that in a bit. All right, so quick probe procedure. We did a naming experience where we held up the name of the stimuli and said the name of it. There was then a 2-hour delay. We then did a probe for the listener component of naming where we, in a field of 3, we said point to X. No feedback was given. Then we waited 20 minutes. We did a probe for the speaker component of naming. We held up the stimulus. Participants named it or said, I don't know. There were 0 instances of no response for the speaker component. So that ensured to us that the SD of holding up the stimulus was sufficient. And then we waited 20 more minutes. Then we gave the probe for the drawing responses with the paper showed earlier. All right. So really quick naming experience. Sets of 5 unknown visual stimuli were identified from the list that I mentioned before. Participants sat across from the experimenter. Experimenter held the stimulus for 3 seconds and said the name of the stimulus. Participant was not required to emit any behavior, but as I mentioned before, all behavior was recorded. So we did not say echo the behavior or echo the response. We didn't tell them to name it. Whatever they did, they did. Once the experimenter had emitted each stimulus, so the name of each stimulus, each tack 4 times for a total of 20 tacks, the naming experience was over. So the listener probe, as I mentioned before, I think this is pretty straightforward, and in the interest of time, we can go ahead and skip this one. Speaker probe, again, held up the name of held up the stimuli, and the participants said the name. That's fine. Go back one more. And then for the key here is for the drawing responses. Again, we just handed, after a 20-minute break, we handed the blank box, the blank sheet of paper with the boxes to our participants. And because they didn't have a history with that, we gave the vocal antecedent of draw as many of the pictures, that's what we said, in any order as you can. And then we gave the participants about 5 minutes to do this. If a participant at the end of 5 minutes was still thinking about it, working on it, still drawing, we let them go for a couple more minutes. So we did not have a hard cutoff for how long they had to draw this thing. All right, so inner observer and inner scorer agreement. So we had inner observer agreement on the vast majority of our naming experiences. as well as our listener and speaker responses. So having that inner observer agreement for the naming experience was very critical because we needed to, since we were taking data on the whispers and the nods and all those other things, we really wanted to make sure that we were scoring those accurately. And with 98% agreement on those, we felt really confident that we were. So drawing responses. So the way that we did this was for every participant, we gave the sheet to 10 independent observers, one at a time. And they simply had to go on and not writing on the paper, just say one, correct or incorrect, 2, correct or incorrect, 3, correct or incorrect, so on and so forth. So if 4 of the 10 agreed that the response was correct, it was said that there was 60% agreement. Based on 6 that agreed, it was incorrect as well, and the response was marked as incorrect. Agreement for a set then was calculated by adding the agreement for each response and dividing by 5, so the number of total responses. So go ahead to the next slide. And you will see that across all the sets, so we had set 1, and then we had a novel set, you will see that we had extremely high agreement for the most part regarding whether or not a response was correct or incorrect. And the value of this can't be underscored. So if you go to the next slide, what we have now established is that condition seeing is observable. You can draw it, and it meets the conditions for the definition of condition seeing. It was measurable. Anyone can identify that as correct or incorrect. But more importantly, multiple observers would agree that it was correct or incorrect. And as a result, we now had evidence to say that condition seeing, or the drawing responses as a measure of condition seeing, could be a behavior of interest that we could study. And I want you to know, or to see, we're talking about a fundamental behavior that could have significant impact on the development of the naming repertoire, and we didn't even know if we could study it. So the establishment of this procedure to verify it and establish it as a behavior could be studied was necessary before we could do anything else. Had this fallen apart, I don't know if I would have graduated. I needed this to be able to stand and move on to the next piece. All right, keep going. Okay, so once we had established that the drawing responses were, and actually, I'm gonna ask, no, it's not there. You guys are gonna have to wait for the graphs to see the order of things, and I apologize about that. So once we had conducted our naming probes, some of our participants had passed those naming probes with condition seeing, and as you will see, some passed and demonstrated condition seeing. Some did not pass and did not demonstrate condition seeing. Others passed the naming probe, both listener and speaker, did not pass listener and speaker, but did have condition seeing. But what we saw was that no individuals, no participants passed the speaker component of condition seeing without the presence of the condition seeing response. So that becomes the crux of what we did. So any participant of those initial 12 that did not pass the naming probe, regardless of whether or not they demonstrated condition seeing, we then did a follow-up intervention based on the Longano and Greer concepts to control for the presence of the auditory stimulus. So if we know that the auditory stimulus and that auditory conditioned response is necessary for the naming behavior, but we're arguing that the conditioned seeing response holds the same weight, then the first thing that we need to do is control for the presence of that auditory stimulus. So the intervention would begin shortly after the second pre-screening probe for those participants who still did not demonstrate naming. So they did not demonstrate naming in set 1, they did not demonstrate naming in set 2, then they screened them one more time and then moved into our delayed phonemic response intervention. Very quickly, and I'll go over it in more detail in a second, sorry, there we go. Oh yeah, here it is. So go ahead and click forward. Yeah, keep going so it pulls the whole thing out. Keep going, there's like 15 bullet points. All right, so what we did was the experimenter said, I'm going to say each of the words, and I want you to repeat them exactly as I do. When we have said each word, I'm going to ask you to tell me all the words. And then we started. So I would say jump. The participant would repeat back to me jump, and I would reinforce that. So now for the first time, the participant is contacting direct reinforcement for emitting the auditory stimulus. Remember, if they don't pass a naming probe, one of the things that we know is that they have not acquired the name of the stimulus. So we wanted to control for that. So that's what we're doing here. We're just teaching the name, no visual stimuli whatsoever. So I said jump, they said jump, I said excellent. Catch, very good. And we would continue for all 5 responses with direct reinforcement. Then I would, once we've got through all 5 vocal stimuli, I would say, now that we've said all of the names, how many can you tell me? And my students, my participants, would then tell me as many names as they could back. And I defined this as a within session echoic probe. So I have a training session and then a within session probe. So catch, jump, nog, that's all I remember. Okay, great, let's go through them again. We did it in a new order and we continued on as such. All right, here is code number 2.
Code 2, everyone. You want to write this down for your survey. If you're a BCBA, you need code 2 to get your CEU certificate abstraction. Okay, so make sure you write code 2 abstraction.
All right. Okay, so continuing on with this procedure. So we go do this back and forth until the participant had emitted all 5 names correctly 3 consecutive times. So that within session probe, they had to get 100% 3 consecutive times. That ended a set of intervention. We then waited at least 2 hours. Then we bring the participants back and ask them to say all 5 names again without any training. This was a delayed echoic probe. So we have a within session echoic probe and a delayed echoic probe. If the participant emitted all 5 names correctly in the delayed echoic probe 3 consecutive times, the intervention was complete. If they emitted, let's see, I think you can go, yeah, go to the next slide. So if the participant emitted any incorrect response or no response for any one or more of the stimuli at any point before those 15 responses, then we went back into the intervention. So a no response would have been them saying 4 of the 5 stimuli and saying that's all they can remember. An incorrect response would have been a mispronounced name, all right? After criterion level responding was reached for the intervention, then we went back to the naming probe and conducted that again. No naming experience was done this time, so it was just listener response, speaker response, and drawing response, all right? So let me, before I go over results, let me give, I don't have a visual and I apologize about that, but let me go over the sequence one more time. So we have naming experience, listener probe, speaker probe, drawing response. All right, and then at that point, we validated the drawing response, and we identified whether or not the participants demonstrated naming. We actually did that again with a novel set of stimuli: naming experience, drawing response, naming experience, listener response, speaker response, drawing response. So from our 12 participants, we ended up with 24 naming probes. From that second set of stimuli, we then went and said, okay, for those participants that did not have the naming response or the naming repertoire, we started the delayed phonemic response intervention. We did our within session probes. We did our delayed echoic probes. Once they were able to master through the delayed echoic probes, then we did our post naming probe, which was listener response, speaker response, drawing response. All right. So the graphs that you're looking at here are from that initial naming response, naming experience, listener, speaker, drawing response. So these dots represent the 24 probes that were done prior to any sort of intervention. And what we want to look for, speaker responses are on top, listener responses are on the bottom. The scatter plots on the right correlate the number of speaker and listener responses with the number of correct drawing responses. All right. On the pie charts, what I want you to key in on is the absence of this type 2 response, kind of right, Kristen, right where your cursor was. So the dark gray, exactly. So this response for the listener response was the presence of listener behavior in the absence of a drawing response. So we had I forget the exact number, participants that demonstrated listener naming in the absence of drawing response, in the absence of conditioned seeing. That's important. You do not see this, that type 2 response in the speaker pie. So we have type 1, type 3, and type 4. Type 1 being speaker naming is absent and drawing responses are absent. Type 2, we don't see. Type 3, speaker is absent and drawing is present. So we can have that relationship. And type 4, speaker is present and drawing response is present. So what we see from this, one, we had a significant correlation for pie chart 1 and no correlation or an insignificant correlation for pie chart 2. The p-values are on the next slide. And we see that drawing is necessary for the speaker component, but not sufficient. So just because you can draw does not mean that you will have full naming, the speaker component of naming. All right, go ahead. All right, so here are our intervention sets. So what you see is the line graph is the back and forth echoic, and the bars are the delayed echoic probes. So for each participant, the full intervention ended when you have those 3 consecutive black bars. You see that this was very quick for most participants. We had one participant who did take a little bit of time, but did eventually get there. All right, so gone over most of those results. The correlational analysis that I want to draw your attention to at the beginning was that it was significant to the p.02 level, which is great, right? We had a smallish participant size, participant pool. There were a couple of participants that needed to be removed, but we found significance. So we saw that there was this relationship between the speaker component of naming and the presence or absence of the drawing responses. That was not the case. We had an insignificant correlation for our listener responses. All right, go ahead. All right, this is, yep, Nope, yep, that's it. Here's a little graph that we don't typically see in behavior analysis, but this was the best way that I could think of presenting a lot of data in a visually appealing way. And what I want you to key in on is the presence in particular of light gray with the bars. And what you will see is there are 0 instances of light gray, meaning speaker behavior, in the absence of the lined pie chart, which is our drawing response. The phase change line in between here is our delayed echoic intervention. So at this point, we have taught the names of the stimuli to all of our participants. They can tell you every single name, all right? If they can tell you all the names and they can draw, then they should be able to identify the speaker response. They should be able to emit that speaker response. If they can't, then they're still missing something else, all right? And what we see in 1, 2, 3, participant 6 in before the intervention, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 7 instances where the speaker response is present, that drawing response is also present as well. We had 1 or 2 instances across these 12 interventions where the drawing response was present, but nothing else was. And in those situations, they didn't even have the listener response, right? So for those kids, naming is completely absent. What we're identifying here is if you have the drawing response and you have that echoic response, then you have a conditioned sensory response for both auditory stimuli and visual stimuli. And those 2 things become predictive of the presence of speaker behavior. All right, so go ahead. I think I just walked you through all of that, so we can skip this slide. Kind of finish up so we can
I'm gonna put the last poll up.
Oh, there we go.
So this poll is asking, what is the significance of the delayed echoic training? %56 people voted. I'm just going to wait a little bit because people are still responding.
Yeah.
66% of people responded. It's still growing. Thank you everyone for being so involved and responding to the polls. All right, I think we're good. So
interesting.
It is interesting. People are still answering, but I'm gonna end the poll now. All right.
So the significance of that delayed echoic training is actually to control for that echoic repertoire. We want to make sure that the participants are indeed emitting that echoic that Longano and Greer identified as necessary for the naming repertoire. It's not necessarily prerequisite to, because it doesn't have to happen before, right? It can emerge as part of it. So it's really controlling for whether or not that repertoire is present. So very nice to the 40 of you who got that. All right. Okay, so what does all of this mean? First and foremost, we, as I belabored already, we have these drawing responses. There was accuracy across all of our participants. We did not have any participants that could not emit the drawing responses at all. And that is important, that drawing was a prerequisite. The presence of these drawing responses in the absence of the visual stimuli or any direct training suggests that conditioned seeing was present, that conditioned response was present as well. That's great. What is the relationship of that to the presence of naming? That it is related to the speaker component, not related to the listener, not directly related to the listener component. And finally, is it related to the acquisition of naming? Now, our data are very limited here, but these initial data show evidence that there is this relationship between acquisition of the conditioned seeing response and the demonstration of the speaker component. All right, so adding on to the implications here. Oh, is a slide? Oh, no, you're good, you're good. Okay, so as mentioned before, Longano and Greer postulated that this visual response was necessary as well, but there was no evidence for that. This adds to that paper and starts to provide evidence for the necessity of that conditioned seeing response and the necessity of conditioned reinforcement for observing those visual stimuli, therefore leading to that conditioned sensory response. It's also important to understand that relational frame theorists, naming theorists have all postulated that these conditioned sensory responses may join object-name relations. This has been spoken about related to the naming concept for 30 years at this point. But the fact that the drawing responses were always present when the speaker component of naming was present suggests that this response may be important to the acquisition of the object name relation beyond simply joining with that relation. So as we are looking at kind of a hierarchical structure, we need to understand that it's not simply that this conditioned seeing joins object name relations as Horn and Lowe postulated, but is rather necessary before any of these relations can emerge. All right, we have 3 minutes left. So finally, I think I have I'll mention some of these. There are significant limitations throughout this study, all of which I encourage people to continue to flesh out, many of which already have. But procedurally, that's where I really want to get to. The experimenters did not verify equivalence between the drawings and the names of the stimuli. So in the drawing, I didn't say, which one is that? Which one is that? Which one is that? So it's a little bit hard to say that there is that concurrence between the conditioned sensory response and the conditioned auditory response. The data suggests that it's there, but we don't have those direct data, that was a huge limitation. All right, and I think that's it. In the nick of time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shanman. I think that is all for today. I have put in the chat a link for those of you who are interested in career opportunities with MPG. Please use that link to attend that talk with Anne Bonimo. Dr. Shanman, I loved your talk, so thank you so much for joining us. It was a great extension of the naming webinar. I wonder how many people saw the naming webinar prior to this. I should have put a poll out there, but that's all right. All right. Well, thank you so much. Hopefully you can all join us again in April for our April webinar. You should probably be getting an email about that, but also check out our website and our professional development calendar as well. And that is it for today. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.